The fluorescent lights of Boston General Hospital hum with a low, persistent drone, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat to Amira. It was well past midnight in the spring of 2024, and the usual bustle of the day had receded into a hushed quiet, leaving only the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft padding of nurses' shoes against the linoleum floors. Amira, her dark hair pulled back neatly from her face, moved with an economy of motion honed by years of night shifts. Her dark, intelligent eyes, usually alight with a gentle warmth, now held a focused intensity as she reviewed the monitors at the central nursing station. Each fluctuating line and numerical readout was a silent language she understood intimately. She was a woman of quiet strength, her presence in the ward a subtle reassurance to both patients and their worried families. Though petite in frame, there was an undeniable steadiness about her, a groundedness that spoke of inner resolve. Tonight, however, a particular unease clung to her, a feeling that had settled in her chest hours ago and refused to dissipate. It centered around one of her patients, a young boy named Kyle. His room was down the hall, a small space filled with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the soft whir of medical equipment. Kyle was a frail child, his small body fighting a relentless illness that had brought him to the brink. Amira had been his primary night nurse for the past few days, and in that time, she had grown fiercely protective of him. There was a vulnerability in his large, pale eyes that tugged at her heart, a quiet resilience that mirrored her own quiet determination. She glanced at the clock above the nursing station, 2:17 a.m. Time moved differently in the hospital at night, stretching into long, silent corridors of observation and vigilance. She decided to make another round, her footsteps barely audible as she walked towards Kyle's room. In the dimly lit private room, Kyle lay still beneath a thin white blanket, his small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His father, David Clark, a striking man with intense green eyes that now held a deep well of worry, sat vigil by his bedside. His handsome features were etched with exhaustion, his usual air of confident authority replaced by a raw vulnerability. He watched his son with an unwavering gaze, his hand hovering just above the boy's, as if willing strength into his fragile body. David Clark was a man accustomed to control, a successful businessman who navigated the complexities of the corporate world with sharp intellect and decisive action. But here, in the quiet stillness of his son's hospital room, he was powerless against the unseen enemy that threatened to steal his child away. His green eyes, usually so full of life and ambition, were now shadowed with fear and a desperate hope. Across the city, in a sprawling, modern house that felt cold and empty despite its expensive furnishings, David's young wife, Emily, lay in their large bed. Her sleep was restless, her brow furrowed with an unspoken tension. Her pale complexion seemed even more stark in the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains. There was a brittle elegance about her, a carefully constructed facade that often masked a simmering impatience. Tonight, however, the mask seemed to slip, revealing a flicker of something darker in her tightly closed eyes. She turned restlessly, pulling the silken sheets around her, a sense of unease pervading the silence of the room. Back in the hushed corridors of the hospital, Amira made her rounds, her senses alert to any subtle change in her patient's conditions. She checked IV drips, adjusted monitors, and offered quiet words of reassurance to those who were awake and anxious. But her thoughts kept returning to Kyle, to the fragility of his life hanging in the balance. She paused outside his room, her hand hovering over the door handle. There was a stillness within that room that felt different tonight, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that pricked at her intuition. She couldn't explain it, but a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. She pushed the door open gently and stepped inside, her gaze immediately drawn to the small figure in the bed. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was a constant reassurance, yet the air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. David still sat by his son's side, his head bowed in what looked like a silent prayer. Amira's watchful eyes scanned the room, a silent assessment of every detail, searching for the source of her disquiet. The night was far from over, and for Amira, the weight of her responsibility felt heavier than ever. The hands on the large circular clock in the otherwise deserted hospital corridor ticked with a deliberate slowness, each second amplifying the profound stillness of the late hour. The muted glow of the emergency exit signs cast long, skeletal shadows that danced imperceptibly with the subtle vibrations of the building's ventilation system. The usual low hum of activity that permeated the hospital, even in the dead of night, had dwindled to a near silence, broken only by the occasional distant beep of a medical device or the soft whoosh of an automatic door further down the hall. Outside, the city of Boston slept under a blanket of darkness, the distant sounds of traffic a muffled murmur that barely penetrated the thick walls of the hospital. Inside, the quiet was heavy, a palpable presence that seemed to amplify every hushed breath and hesitant footstep. A figure moved with a furtive grace through the dim corridors, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness. It was Emily Clark, her usually composed features now contorted into an expression that was far removed from her practiced elegance. Her eyes, wide and darting, scanned the empty hallways with a nervous intensity, as if expecting unseen observers to materialize from the very walls. She clutched a small dark purse tightly against her side, its contents a secret she guarded with a desperate resolve. Her movements were uncharacteristic, lacking the smooth, confident stride she usually displayed. Tonight, there was a hurried, almost frantic quality to her steps, each footfall a silent betrayal of her inner turmoil. She hugged the edges of the walls, her body tense, as if trying to merge with the very structure of the building, to become invisible in the oppressive quiet. She reached the door of Kyle's room, her breath catching in her throat. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the darkened corridor. She hesitated for a fleeting moment, her hand hovering over the cool metal of the door handle. A battle seemed to rage within her, a silent conflict between the carefully constructed image she presented to the world and the dark impulse that had driven her to the hospital in the dead of night. Her face, usually a mask of youthful beauty, was now etched with a grim determination. Her lips were pressed into a thin, hard line, and her green eyes, so often used to charm and manipulate, now held a chilling focus. She pushed the door open further, inch by silent inch, her movements betraying a practiced stealth. Inside the room, the only illumination came from the soft glow of the medical monitors and the faint nightlight in the corner, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around the still form of the sleeping boy. Kyle lay motionless in the bed, his small face pale and peaceful in his unconsciousness. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the quiet space, a fragile testament to the life that still flickered within him. Emily's gaze fell upon the boy's vulnerable form, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed her features. It was a fleeting expression, quickly masked by a renewed wave of dark resolve. She reached into her purse, her fingers fumbling slightly as she retrieved a small, slender vial. The glass caught the faint light, revealing a viscous, opaque liquid swirling within. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the vial, her eyes fixed on the innocent face of the sleeping child. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of her intent. She leaned closer to the bed, her shadow falling over the small, still figure. At that precise moment, a soft sound broke the heavy silence of the corridor. It was the almost imperceptible rustle of fabric, the barely audible shift of weight. Amira, her rounds taking her past Kyle's room once more, noticed the faint sliver of light emanating from the slightly ajar door. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. She had checked on Kyle only a short while ago, and the door had been closed. Her steps faltered. She paused in the darkened hallway, her senses immediately on high alert. The combination of the open door and the unusual stillness within the room triggered an instinct honed by years of nursing, a silent alarm that something was amiss. She moved closer, her footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. She peered through the narrow opening, her dark eyes struggling to penetrate the dim light within. A figure stood beside Kyle's bed, a figure that was not David, a figure that radiated a palpable sense of wrongness. Amira froze, her breath catching in her throat, a cold premonition gripping her heart. She couldn't make out the person's features clearly in the low light, but the tense posture and the furtive movements sent a jolt of alarm through her. Something was terribly wrong. The scene inside Kyle's dimly lit room erupted in a sudden, silent chaos. Amira's quiet apprehension transmuted into swift, decisive action. The moment her eyes registered the vial clutched in Emily's trembling hand. Poised precariously close to Kyle's still form, a surge of adrenaline propelled her forward. There was no time for hesitation, no space for doubt. Her training, her instincts, and a fierce protectiveness for the vulnerable child coalesced into a single powerful impulse. She lunged into the room, her movements a blur of focused energy. Emily, startled by the unexpected intrusion, recoiled, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and terror. The vial slipped slightly in her grasp. Amira reached out, her hand clamping down on Emily's wrist. With a sharp, decisive twist, Amira managed to dislodge the vial from Emily's grasp. The small glass container tumbled through the air, landing with a soft thud on the linoleum floor near the bedside table, the viscous liquid within sloshing ominously. Panic flared in Emily's eyes. Her carefully constructed composure shattered, replaced by a raw, primal fear of exposure. Her mind raced, calculating escape routes, desperate to erase the evidence of her presence and her intent. Without a word, she shoved past Amira, her body tense and rigid, and bolted towards the open doorway, her footsteps echoing sharply in the sudden silence. Amira, her attention immediately snapping back to Kyle, saw the horrifying reality of the situation. The boy's breathing had become shallow and erratic, his small chest barely rising and falling. His face, already pale, had taken on a worrying bluish tinge. Every precious second counted. Ignoring the fleeing figure of Emily, Amira whirled around and focused all her energy on the child. Her movements were swift and precise, each action ingrained by years of emergency training. She pressed the emergency call button, her hand already moving to assess Kyle's vital signs. His pulse was faint, almost imperceptible. Code Blue, Pediatric Intensive Care, Room 312. Her voice, though strained with urgency, remained clear and commanding as she spoke into the wall-mounted communicator. Without waiting for a response, she began the initial steps of resuscitation. She positioned Kyle's small body carefully, tilting his head back to open his airway. Her fingers checked for any obstruction, her mind racing through the protocols. She placed her ear close to his mouth, listening for any sign of breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, which had been a constant presence, now began to falter, the steady peaks and valleys becoming erratic and jagged. A cold dread washed over Amira, but she pushed it down, her focus unwavering. She began chest compressions, her hands pressing firmly but gently on his small sternum, counting silently in her head, maintaining the precise rhythm and depth required for a child. Her brow furrowed with concentration, her lips pressed tightly together. Just as she was about to administer rescue breaths, the sound of frantic footsteps echoed in the hallway. David, who had been sitting in a nearby chair, his head bowed in exhaustion, had been jolted awake by the commotion and the raised voices. He stumbled to his feet and rushed towards Kyle's room, his heart pounding with a sudden, inexplicable fear. He burst through the doorway, his eyes widening in horror at the chaotic scene that unfolded before him. He saw Amira kneeling over his son, her hands pressing urgently on his chest. He saw the overturned bedside table, the spilled vial glinting ominously on the floor, and the retreating figure of a woman disappearing down the corridor. A woman whose silhouette, even in his shock, he recognized with a sickening lurch in his stomach. His breath hitched in his throat, a strangled cry escaping his lips. "Kyle!" His voice was a raw, ragged whisper filled with a primal fear. He stood frozen in the doorway for a split second, his mind struggling to comprehend the horrifying tableau before him. His green eyes darted from Amira's focused face to his son's still form, then to the spilled vial in the empty corridor. A wave of nausea washed over him, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a terrifying picture. Amira, acutely aware of David's presence, offered a brief, strained glance, her eyes conveying the gravity of the situation without uttering a word. Then her focus returned entirely to Kyle. The arrival of the crash cart, pushed by two other nurses and a doctor, broke the stunned silence. The small room suddenly filled with a flurry of controlled activity. Amira quickly briefed the arriving medical team, her voice calm and professional despite the urgency of the situation. She continued chest compressions as the doctor took over airway management, inserting an endotracheal tube. The nurses worked swiftly, connecting monitors, preparing medications, their movements synchronized and efficient. David stood huddled in the corner of the room, his face ashen, his body trembling. His eyes remained fixed on his son, on the small, fragile life that hung precariously in the balance. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the horrifying images he had just witnessed. The fleeing figure, Emily, the spilled vial. A terrifying suspicion began to solidify in his heart, a cold dread that threatened to overwhelm him. Amira, her uniform now damp with sweat, Her brow furrowed in intense concentration, remained at Kyle's side, her hands working tirelessly. She administered medications, monitored the vital signs displayed on the screen, her every action guided by a fierce determination to pull the boy back from the brink. The small room became a battleground, a silent, desperate fight against the encroaching darkness. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors remained erratic, a stark reminder of the precariousness of their struggle. Amira's focus never wavered, her unwavering resolve the only beacon of hope in the tense, suffocating atmosphere. The immediate crisis had passed, the frantic energy of the code blue receding into a tense vigilance. Kyle remained in the pediatric intensive care unit, his small body tethered to a network of tubes and wires, each connection a fragile lifeline. Amira became a constant presence by his bedside, her days and nights blurring into a continuous cycle of monitoring, administering medication, and meticulously adjusting his care. Sleep became a luxury she could scarcely afford, snatched in brief intervals on a hard chair in the corner of the room or during hurried breaks in the quiet nurse's lounge. Her face, usually animated with a gentle smile for her patients, now carried a permanent air of focused determination. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of countless sleepless hours, but her gaze remained sharp and unwavering as she studied the readings on the monitors, her mind constantly analyzing the subtle shifts in Kyle's condition. Every fractional change in his heart rate, every slight variation in his breathing pattern was noted, recorded, and acted upon with precision and care. She anticipated his needs before they were even voiced, her intuitive understanding of his fragile state guiding her every action. David remained a steadfast presence in the room, a silent sentinel watching over his son. His initial shock and horror had slowly given way to a profound gratitude and a growing respect for Amira. His green eyes, still shadowed with worry, followed her every movement with an almost reverent attention. He witnessed her tireless dedication, the gentle touch with which she adjusted Kyle's blankets, the quiet reassurance she murmured even when the boy was unconscious. He saw in her a strength and compassion that he had rarely encountered. He often sat for hours in a chair near the window, his gaze fixed on Amira, a silent acknowledgement of the lifeline she represented for his son. He brought her lukewarm coffee and offered quiet words of thanks, his voice thick with emotion that he struggled to articulate fully. In stark contrast, Emily's presence in the hospital became increasingly infrequent. Her initial visits after the incident were marked by a forced concern and a nervous agitation. Her green eyes, once so vibrant, now held a guarded coolness, and her interactions with both Kyle and David were brief and strained. She offered perfunctory inquiries about Kyle's condition, her gaze often drifting away, her attention seemingly elsewhere. Her touch, when she did briefly lay a hand on Kyle's arm, felt distant and unnatural. Amira observed Emily's behavior with a quiet unease. There was a disconnect between her words of concern and the coldness in her eyes, a subtle dissonance that Amira's keen intuition registered. She noticed the fleeting moments of irritation that flickered across Emily's face when Kyle's condition showed little improvement, the barely concealed sighs of impatience. But Amira's primary focus remained resolutely on Kyle. The battle for his life consumed all her energy and attention, leaving little room for speculation about the strange dynamics between father and stepmother. The days bled into nights marked only by the changing shifts of the hospital staff and the slow incremental progress in Kyle's condition. Amira continued her unwavering vigil, her commitment fueled by a deep sense of responsibility and a growing affection for the small boy who fought so bravely. She spoke to him softly, her voice a soothing balm in the sterile environment, telling him stories and encouraging him to keep fighting. She adjusted his pillows, moistened his lips, and held his small hand in hers, offering a silent reassurance of her presence. David watched this quiet devotion unfold, his admiration for Amira deepening with each passing hour. He saw the genuine care in her eyes, the unwavering determination in her touch. He began to notice small details, the way she anticipated Kyle's discomfort, the gentle song she hummed softly under her breath, the almost imperceptible smile that touched her lips when Kyle showed even the slightest sign of improvement. Emily's visits dwindled to mere formalities, brief appearances marked by an air of detachment. Her eyes often flickered towards Amira with a strange mixture of resentment and something akin to fear. Amira noticed these glances, the subtle tightening of Emily's jaw, the way her hands clenched nervously in her lap. But she remained focused on her patient, her professional demeanor unwavering. The unspoken tension in the room was palpable, a silent undercurrent that David seemed increasingly aware of, his green eyes often shifting between his wife and the dedicated nurse with a growing unease. The weight of the near tragedy hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that could lurk beneath a veneer of normalcy. Amira, the quiet guardian at Kyle's bedside, remained the steadfast beacon of hope, her tireless efforts slowly but surely guiding the small boy back towards the light. The Besonne Noche continued, each one a testament to her unwavering commitment and the silent battle she waged alongside a small boy fighting for his life. As the relentless days and nights blurred into a semblance of routine within the sterile confines of the PICU, a subtle but significant shift occurred in Kyle's condition. The erratic beeping of the monitors gradually settled into a more regular rhythm. The shallow breaths deepened and a faint flush returned to his pale cheeks. Amira's unwavering vigilance and meticulous care were slowly, painstakingly yielding results. The small victories, a slight squeeze of her hand, a flicker of his eyelids, were met with quiet relief and renewed determination. David, who had remained a constant presence, witnessed this gradual return to life with a profound sense of gratitude. His green eyes, though still bearing the marks of sleepless nights and lingering worry, now held a glimmer of hope. He watched Amira's every interaction with his son, the gentle way she spoke to him, the unwavering focus in her dark eyes, and a deep respect blossomed within him. However, amidst this fragile progress, a growing unease began to gnaw at David. He couldn't shake the memory of Emily's hurried departure from Kyle's room that night, the fleeting glimpse of fear in her eyes. He replayed their subsequent interactions, her forced concern, her evasiveness when he asked about her presence in the hospital so late. He recalled the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands, the way she avoided his gaze. The image of the spilled vial on the floor, a silent testament to a terrifying possibility, haunted him. He remembered Amira's swift intervention, her unwavering focus on saving Kyle's life. A chilling suspicion began to take root in his mind, a seed of doubt that grew with each passing day. He started to observe Emily more closely, his green eyes now filled with a wary scrutiny. He noticed her increasing agitation, her nervous pacing around their otherwise silent house. She jumped at the slightest sound, her sleep remained fitful, and her conversations with him were stilted and distant. When he tried to talk about Kyle, she would offer brief, generic responses, her gaze drifting away as if the subject made her deeply uncomfortable. He remembered the hushed phone calls she took in another room, her voice low and guarded. He recalled the times she had abruptly ended conversations when he entered the room. Small, seemingly insignificant details began to coalesce into a disturbing pattern. The memory of the vial became an obsession. He found himself replaying the scene in his mind, Amira's decisive action, Emily's frantic escape. He couldn't reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the chilling implications of that night. Driven by a gnawing suspicion and a desperate need for answers, David began his own quiet investigation. He subtly questioned the hospital staff, careful not to raise any alarms. He reviewed security footage, his green eyes scanning hours of grainy images, searching for any clue that might shed light on Emily's presence in Kyle's room that night. He remembered Amira's initial reaction, the way she had frozen in the corridor upon seeing Emily. He sought her out during one of her brief breaks, his voice low and hesitant as he asked her about what she had seen. Amira, her dark eyes filled with a quiet understanding of his unspoken fears, recounted the events of that night with a precise clarity, her words confirming his growing dread. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality. The vial, Emily's behavior, Amira's intervention, it all pointed to a horrifying truth that David struggled to comprehend. The woman he had married, the woman who was supposed to care for his son, had been a threat to his very life. A wave of nausea washed over him, followed by a cold fury. The betrayal cut deep, a sharp, agonizing wound. His primary concern, however, remained Kyle's safety. He knew he had to act swiftly and decisively. Gathering the fragmented pieces of evidence, Amira's account, his own observations of Emily's increasingly erratic behavior, and the lingering image of the vial, David made a difficult decision. He contacted the authorities. He met with the police detectives, his voice strained but resolute as he recounted the events of that night. He presented the information he had gathered, his green eyes filled with a mixture of grief and a steely determination to protect his son. The police took his allegations seriously. They interviewed Amira, whose calm and detailed account corroborated David's suspicions. They launched their own investigation, their experienced eyes quickly recognizing the gravity of the situation. The evidence mounted swiftly. Security footage confirmed Emily's clandestine entry into Kyle's room late that night. Further investigation revealed inconsistencies in Emily's statements and a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture. The authorities acted quickly. Emily was apprehended at their home, her initial shock giving way to a cold, defiant silence. The small vial, recovered from the floor of Kyle's room, was sent for analysis. David received the news of Emily's arrest with a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the threat to his son had been neutralized warred with the agonizing realization of his wife's betrayal. He felt a profound sense of shock and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the woman he had loved with the chilling actions she had allegedly taken. Amidst this turmoil, his gratitude towards Amira deepened immeasurably. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that her swift action and unwavering dedication had saved his son's life. He looked at her, his green eyes filled with a profound and heartfelt thankfulness that transcended words. He saw in her not just a skilled nurse, but a guardian angel who had intervened in the darkest of nights. The weight of his wife's betrayal was immense, but the unwavering presence of Amira, the silent protector of his child, offered a fragile glimmer of hope in the midst of his despair. Time, a relentless current, flowed onward, carrying with it the weight of past trauma and the fragile promise of a new beginning. Kyle, his small body displaying a remarkable resilience, gradually mended under the unwavering care of Amira and the constant, loving presence of his father. The sterile confines of the hospital room slowly transformed into a space filled with quiet stories, gentle laughter, and the unspoken language of healing. Amira's dark eyes, once shadowed with concern, now often held a soft warmth as she watched Kyle's tentative steps towards recovery. She engaged him in quiet games, read him stories in soothing tones, and patiently guided him through his physical therapy exercises. David, witnessing this tender care, found his initial gratitude for Amira deepening into a profound and undeniable affection. He spent countless hours by their side, his green eyes observing Amira's innate kindness, her unwavering patience, and the genuine connection she had forged with his son. He saw in her not only the woman who had saved Kyle's life, but also a person of extraordinary empathy and quiet strength, someone who radiated a warmth that had been absent from his life for far too long. The sterile environment of the hospital seemed to soften around her presence, infused with a sense of genuine human connection. As Kyle grew stronger, the need for constant medical supervision lessened, and their world began to expand beyond the hospital walls. Amira transitioned from Kyle's dedicated nurse to a cherished presence in their home. She moved into the spacious house that had once felt cold and empty, her quiet strength and gentle spirit gradually filling the void left by the chilling betrayal. She created a sense of calm and stability, her presence a soothing balm for both father and son. David found himself increasingly drawn to Amira's quiet wisdom and compassionate nature. He sought her counsel not only on matters concerning Kyle, but also on the everyday complexities of life. He admired her unwavering integrity, her selfless dedication, and the subtle strength that lay beneath her gentle demeanor. He saw her interact with Kyle, her dark eyes filled with genuine affection, and a deep longing began to stir within him, a yearning for a connection that transcended mere gratitude. One quiet evening, as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, David found himself alone with Amira. Kyle was upstairs, finally sleeping soundly after a day filled with tentative adventures in the garden. David turned to Amira, his green eyes filled with an earnest sincerity. The words he had held back for so long finally found their voice, spoken softly but with a profound depth of feeling. He confessed the emotions that had been growing within him, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together, but emphasizing the genuine connection he felt. Amira listened intently, her dark eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and a quiet understanding. The events of the past months had forged an undeniable bond between them, a shared experience of fear, hope, and ultimately survival. She had witnessed David's raw vulnerability, his unwavering love for his son, and the quiet strength he had displayed in the face of unimaginable betrayal. His heartfelt confession resonated deeply within her. She had never sought personal gain or recognition, her focus solely on the well-being of her patient. Yet in the midst of the crisis, a quiet respect and a burgeoning affection for David had taken root in her heart. Touched by his sincerity and recognizing the genuine connection they shared, she responded to his heartfelt words with a gentle affirmation of her own feelings. Their relationship blossomed slowly, nurtured by mutual respect, shared experiences, and a deep and abiding love for Kyle. The shadow of the past remained, a stark reminder of the fragility of life, but it also served as a foundation for their growing connection, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the unexpected paths that life could take. In the following months, their bond deepened, solidifying into a quiet commitment. David, having navigated the painful legal proceedings and secured Kyle's future, found himself drawn to the warmth and stability that Amira brought into their lives. He saw in her not only a loving caregiver for his son, but also a steadfast partner, a woman whose quiet strength and compassionate heart complemented his own more outwardly driven nature. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in the garden, bathed in the soft glow of a late summer afternoon. Kyle, beaming with happiness, stood between them as they exchanged vows, their words unspoken but deeply felt. Their union, born from the ashes of tragedy and nurtured by mutual respect and a shared love for the little boy who had inadvertently brought them together, marked not an end, but a profound and hopeful new beginning. Amira, who had never sought personal reward or recognition, found herself embraced by a loving family, her quiet dedication finally acknowledged, not with accolades, but with the deep and abiding affection of a man and a child whose lives she had irrevocably touched. David, having weathered the storm of betrayal and loss, found not only a new wife, but also a true friend and a devoted mother for his son, a woman whose quiet strength and unwavering kindness had illuminated the darkest of times. Their future unfolded before them, not as a grand dramatic narrative, but as a quiet tapestry woven with threads of love, resilience, and the enduring power of human connection.